Welcome back to the beginner's course for consultants. Now, in the previous lesson, I explained how to sign an agreement with the customer. And once you actually sign the agreement, then the real job begins. This is where you actually have to deliver whatever you have promised to do. Now, the problem is that these consulting arrangements where you actually implement a certain project for a client can be quite complex, and it's easy actually to lose control over these kind of projects, which would ultimately lead to a very unsatisfied client. So in this lesson today, I'll show you what are the critical success factors for running this kind of an implementation project, what are the typical phases in such a project, what kind of tools you need to use, how to communicate with the client, and finally how to handle documentation as part of project management. So after you watch this video, you'll have a clear idea on what activities you need to perform in order for your project to succeed. Now, in the next couple of lessons, I'll cover different types of projects that you might have as a consultant, like training project, internal audit, these kind of things. But in this lesson today, I'll focus on so-called implementation project, where the goal could be that you want to help your client become, for example, compliant with a certain regulation, or that you want to help a client get certified against some ISO standard or similar to this. And the things that I'll mention in this lesson today are valid if you go for these, let's say, complete compliance projects with a certain framework. But these elements also work if you go for a smaller scope project. For example, if you're doing only the risk assessment, for example, for DORA regulation, you will again use the same principles that I'll explain in the lesson today. Okay, let's first see what are these key success factors for your project that you need to focus on. So first, you need to obtain the support from your senior management. Then you need to have a competent project manager within the company. You also need a very good project plan with clear steps and milestones. Next, you need to involve key stakeholders as you roll out your project, and you have to simplify and demystify the framework that you're working with. Now, I'll explain these first four things later on throughout this video, but let me now explain what I mean by simplification and demystification. This means that whenever you do a particular consulting activity, you should always choose a path which is easier to understand and simpler for a client. So do not make, let's say, a risk assessment complex if this is not needed. Why would you do so? You would only confuse your client, so go for something that is easier to understand, quicker to implement, and believe me, this is something that your clients will appreciate. Also, always try to demystify, which means you have to explain what stands actually behind some requirement and actually show that this is not rocket science, that this is something that is rather easy to understand. And again, clients will appreciate your openness and your candor, and they will understand that this is not so horribly difficult to understand. And actually, the more you simplify, the more you demystify, they will appreciate you more and treat you more as an expert. And also, this is how you'll get other customers, because a satisfied customer will recommend you to other potential clients. Okay, let me now go through typical phases that you will have in an implementation project. And don't worry, I didn't forget about the first four key success factors. I'll explain them along the way as I go through these other topics in this lesson. You'll typically have four phases. The first one is a preparatory phase. The second one is where you do an analysis and a strategy. And in the third phase, you actually implement whatever you concluded in your strategy. And the fourth phase is where you start completing your activities and move towards the closure of the project and also hand over to the client. Now, this first preparatory phase has the purpose of actually setting up everything that is important in the project. And this is where you start with the kickoff meeting with the client. And at this meeting, you actually have to agree with the client about a couple of key things. So you have to agree who will be the sponsor of the project from the side of the client. And this sponsor means a member of the senior management who is not actively participating in the project, but to whom you can turn to if there is a problem with the project, so that that person can resolve this problem quickly and efficiently because of his or her authority. And this person really needs to be interested in the positive outcome of the project. So this is basically how this person should be chosen from the senior management. And basically this is how you achieve this support from the senior management that I mentioned, and as one of the key success factors, because this enables you to have direct line of communication with someone who has the power in the company. Second, you need to agree with the client who should be the project manager. As I explained in one of my previous lessons, it is better that a project manager is someone from the company who knows actually how the company is organized, what are the stakeholders in the company and so on, and that this is not you as an outsider, because this will then not only introduce organizational burden on you, but this would also decrease the chances of you actually have a successful project. You should also define who are the project team members. And this project team is usually not needed for small companies, but if you have mid-size or a larger company, then this is certainly very good to have. And typically these project team members will be mid-level managers from the departments that are the most involved in this kind of a project. And you also have to go through this work plan that you presented to your clients in the phase when you were making the proposal and once you signed the agreement. So you have to go through these details and refine whatever needs to be explained and clarified. Then the next step in this preparatory phase is that you draw a project plan together with the project manager, where you include all of these things that you agreed in the kickoff meeting, and where you include also the milestones, the outcomes, deadlines, and all of these things. As part of this preparatory phase, you might also do the gap analysis if this is something that you agreed with the client. This might be useful for larger companies, whereas for mid-size or smaller companies, it usually is not very useful. And in this preparatory phase, if you're doing, for example, ISO 27001 implementation project, you might also do some initial training about the basics of the standards for the project team. You would also define the ISMS scope. You would define the expectations of interested parties, and you would also define this top-level information security policy. So all of these things together in this preparatory phase gives you, I would say, a very good kickstart of your project so that it's based on solid foundations. Okay, and then the second phase is this analysis and strategy making phase, where you actually want to do an in-depth analysis and conclude what is the best course of action for a particular situation in the company in the context of whatever this company is operating in. So if you're doing, for example, ISO 27001 implementation project, this would include defining the risk assessment methodology and then performing risk assessment and risk treatment, because in the context of ISO 27001, this is how you analyze actually the most important facts about the company. And then next comes this statement of applicability, where you basically define the strategy, meaning which controls you want to implement and why, and also which controls you do not want to implement. And finally, you define this implementation plan or a risk treatment plan, where you define which controls, which documents, which technologies will be implemented by whom, with which kind of a budget, what kind of deadlines, and so on. So again, in this kind of a phase, the most crucial decisions around the project are being made. In the third phase of the project, you actually implement this strategy. So again, in the example of ISO 27001, this is where you implement all the controls, meaning all the documents, you change the processes if needed, you might acquire some new technology, and so on. In parallel to this, you have to do this training and awareness, because whenever there is a new process or a technology, you have to explain to your employees what exactly they have to change, how they have to do their activities in a different way, and you also have to explain them why. This means you have to raise awareness on why these changes are important. Of course, you might agree with your client whether this training and awareness is part of your implementation project or that this is something that they do on their own. And the third thing, you have to help your clients start monitoring and measuring whatever they have started to implement. So if they have some kind of a new technology, then they can measure actually what is the cost versus the outputs and the benefits of this new technology. Of course, you also have to help your client set certain objectives, meaning expectations on all of these changes, and then measure if they're progressing towards these objectives. Okay, and the last fourth phase is this closure and handover towards the client. And in case of ISO 27001, this could include steps like helping client perform an internal audit, help them do the management review, help them execute the corrective actions, help them prepare for a certification audit, assist them during the certification audit, and finally, once the certification audit is completed, then do the handover of everything that is needed towards the client. So ultimately, this fourth phase is making sure that everything is done that needs to be done towards the completion of the project, so that the client can actually continue using whatever you have produced during this kind of a project. Now, let's see, how do you normally communicate with the clients? First of all, if you communicate with them on a regular basis through, let's say, email or maybe some messaging system like Slack, you actually have to respond to their messages very quickly. So don't wait for a couple of days. Rather try to respond within a couple of hours, so that they see that you are very committed towards the project. Further, you will need to have these formal project meetings, which can happen, let's say, once a month or maybe once every 2 weeks, where you will actually compare your progress towards milestones, and where you have to discuss all kinds of problems that will typically appear during the project and how these need to be resolved. Typically, these problems will be so that some people within the company are late, that they are not responding to your messages, these kind of things. Now, it is not needed that you record these project meetings, but as a minimum, you should create some kind of a summary from each of these meetings and send this summary to the project manager, so that it is confirmed that really this is what was discussed and agreed on. Now, as part of this communication, you'll also have to deal with various stakeholders that are important within the company. So, for example, in case of ISO 27001 implementation, you'll have to deal actually with each head of the department that is in part of the scope of implementation, because some of them might not actually see this as something that is beneficial for them. So to overcome this problem, you actually have to show them that actually there are benefits for their department if this kind of a standard is implemented. So for example, let's say that you have a sales department which is not very happy with the introduction of some security rules, but if you explain to the head of the sales department that actually this will decrease the chances of some sensitive information leaking out from the sales department towards their competitors, then they might also see a clear benefit in implementing this kind of security rules. Second technique would be that you actually include these heads of the departments in review of any policies and procedures that you're writing, so that they actually influence what is the final text and what are the rules that have to be complied with. When it comes to some influential employees, you also have to include them in this process of writing documents, where you actually include whatever inputs they want to suggest and improve these documents according to their suggestions. And of course, as I mentioned, you have to raise awareness for anyone that is involved in this project. And all of these potential problems that I mentioned are nothing else but a resistance to change, because it's hard for people to start doing something in a different way. And if you want to learn more on how to handle this change process, you can take a look at this advanced course for consultants, where I dedicate the whole module on how to handle this change management. Okay, regarding tools that you need throughout the project, there are several tools that you'll need. Some kind of a tool for task management, where you will track all the tasks. You'll need some kind of a communication system like email, but also Slack or Microsoft Teams. You'll need some system for managing files like Microsoft SharePoint or Box or Dropbox or something similar. You might need some GRC tools, or governance, risk and compliance tool, for handling various processes for a client. You might need a training tool if you're doing the training, and so on. And I explained all of these tools in one of my previous lessons in this course. course, so you can take a look at this lesson for more details. Now, related to documentation, there are some best practices that you have to follow when you write documents for a client. So, for example, each document that you produce, you have to adapt it for specific circumstances in the company. And this typically means that you have to adapt it for their specific processes, for their specific structure, meaning roles and responsibilities they have in a company, and for their technology. And you can actually obtain all of this information by interviewing all the relevant employees and then producing documents that are highly personalized for what they need. And once this first draft of the document is completed, then you have to send it for review, as I already explained. And then after you make a couple of revisions, then you have to send it for approval, which will in most cases be this sponsor of the project that I also mentioned earlier. And then you have to follow up to see if this document is properly distributed. Good practice is that you also define owner for each document, so that it's very clear who needs to update this document when required, and you also set the timing on how often this needs to happen. So let's say every 6 months or every 12 months or so on. And this is also a very good way to actually hand over the responsibility for these documents towards the client. And also, as I mentioned before, if you want these documents to be accepted in a better way, then you have to raise awareness with the employees and also train them on how to perform, let's say, these new activities if they did not exist before. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and let me know in the comments below if you have any questions on how to run implementation projects as a consultant, and I'll answer as quick as I can. And I know that I didn't really cover everything around implementation projects because it's quite difficult to do in only one lesson. So here are a couple of other learning materials that you can use to learn more about this topic, and you'll also find the links below this video. So first of all, there is this advanced course for consultants that has several lessons, including how to handle resistance towards change, how to include senior management in the project, how to approach this lean implementation, how to do remote consulting, and so on. Second, you have this Secure and Simple podcast where I interview successful consultants on how they handle their projects, and you'll see several interesting episodes there. One of them is, let's say, how to handle policies and procedures. There are some episodes how to do the training, and so on. Also, on Advisera website, you'll find a couple of products that will help you with implementation projects. So you'll find several lead implementer courses for various frameworks where you will learn in more depth on how to implement projects. You will also see this Conformio. This is a small GRC tool which can help you as a consultant implement these kind of projects with your clients. And there is also this Company Training Academy, and this is a training platform where you as a consultant can actually do these online trainings for your clients. Finally, in the next lesson of this beginner's course, you will learn how to handle training projects because the logic there is a little bit different from these implementation projects. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel not to miss any of my new videos, and I publish videos about cybersecurity, compliance and governance every week. Thanks for watching.